Tonight, our program is Tom Atkinson, and it is Discovering Your Characters. Tom is from Cincinnati. Tom is an old friend, as some of you heard us talking when we first got together, whom I've always admired for this very reason. He creates wonderful, engaging, quirky, and sometimes rough and tumble characters who are dealing with the issues of human living. In his new novel, TIKI Man, published by Regal House, Tom brings to life Pear, a grown man barely holding on, and Tammy, a 10-year-old daughter of Pear's incarcerated girlfriend, along with many others in a Florida landscape. This is Tom's second novel. Strobe Life is his first, and he's been successful publishing short stories and plays. Tom, you might be interested that we ventured into playwriting with a guild workshop in August. Jeanette Brown, who's on the screen somewhere there, put this together for us, and it was over several Friday nights. They wrote 10-minute plays, and then we got to hear them read at our September meeting. It was loads of fun to see the production of that. And a little reminder to our group tonight, if you click the view button in the upper right-hand corner and select speaker view, you'll get Tom up close and personal. So Writer Guild.
That could be frightening.
Yeah. And this, by the way, is TIKI Man. So Tom, come on down.
All right. I thought what I would do first is just read you the first page of TIKI Man, just to give you a flavor. The entire novel takes place over a single day, and it's Pear and Tammy, and they're sort of working through something. And then after that, I'm going to read a few pages from a chapter much later in the book that has a whole bunch of the characters that Bob's talking about, and then we can sort of pick them apart when we get there. So this is chapter 1, and it's called The Haitians. A few months back, when Tammy first came down here to Florida, I had a hard time figuring out what to do with her when I went to work. Before he disappeared, her dad stuck her on a bus up in Ohio without bothering to find out how Missy's sentencing went. He's a Franklin from the meth and incest part of that state, and I never heard Missy say his last name without adding trash to it, like Franklin Trash might actually be his name. Maybe he thought the judge would take her condition into account. No such luck. She's doing a 2-year bit up at Lowell Correctional in Ocala, 3 hots and a cot and free dental, which is better than us most days. I'm stuck here squatting in the condo me and Misty shared, trying to take care of her daughter from a marriage gone bad years before we met. I left Tammy alone at first, let her sleep late and came home a little early, but she didn't like that, being home alone all day. She wouldn't leave the house, not even to play in the driveway. And even a 10-year-old can only watch Tom and Jerry cartoons for so long. Clyde's wife, Vera, watched her some, but I didn't want to impose. They're our neighbors across the street, and he's the unofficial mayor because they've lived here forever. And Vera, she never comes out of the house, but still knows everybody else's business. He told me that since they threw these condos up 22 years ago, they've been the only Black family. And that's saying something, since half the street swaps out every night. So that's page 1. Now, the next part that I want to read, it has a whole bunch of characters in it, and you don't really need to know that much about them, I don't think, to get what's going on. But what you do need to know is that there's a police officer off duty, Officer Orange, and he's called Officer Orange because he's got a really bad fake tan. He's a bodybuilder with a bad fake tan. And he's off duty and he's riding around with another police officer because he thinks that a homeless guy named Tampon John has vandalized his big fancy Jeep in the parking lot. And Pear and Tammy are having their bologna barbecue, which is when they grill bologna out on the driveway and everybody's stopping by to visit. And there's Delron, who is an inordinately large black man who is the bouncer up at Sassy Merlot's 2, which is the strip club. And then his friend is Barry, who is the Neil Diamond impersonator on the gambling boat. So hopefully that's all you need to know. And if not, you'll have to catch me at the end. I'm gonna have to read this on the computer, so I'm not gonna be looking at y'all for a minute. So hold on. Okay. And where are we? A car crept slowly down our street. And when it got close enough, I saw it was Barry's old Corolla settled down on the passenger side like the springs were shot because Delron was in there with him. Barry pulled up onto the edge of the curb. He leaned forward to see around Delron and called, "Bologna barbecue?" And Tammy yelled, "You bet, the grill's still hot." I said, "You smell that all the way over at Whispering Pines?" And he said, "If I jumped in a car every time I smelled fried bologna in the Whispering Pines trailer park, I'd never get out of the car." He got out of the driver's side and came around to open the door for Delron. He turned and said, "We're not dating or anything. The inside handle's broke and Delron can't get his tiny arms around far enough to reach the outside." Delron unfolded himself out of the car like one of those guys at the circus in a glass box. He nodded to everyone except Pearl and stood behind Barry like a bear trying to hide behind a fire plug. He looked like he was still drunk or drunk again, but even though his feet were as big as cinder blocks and wide apart, he was swaying gently like all those Atlanta assholes up at the marina trying to get their land legs back after a day charter fishing. Clyde said, "Hey, Delron." And Vera said, "I can't remember the last time we saw you at Sunday service." And Delrod hung his head and said, "No, ma'am, I work awful late on Saturday night. It's our busiest night. And by the time I get done taking out the trash and mopping up baby oil, it's usually near on 4 a.m. When he said taking out the trash, I didn't know if he meant bouncing drunks like Dwayne or really taking out the trash. Not that I guess it mattered. Vera didn't seem inclined to consider the particulars of Delron's line of work. So she said, "Well, keep the Lord in your heart and we'll be happy when we see you back." And he said, "Yes, ma'am." Then Vera clapped her hands lightly and looked at Clyde. "It's time for my show. You coming?" And Clyde said, "I'll be along directly." And after she limped out of earshot, he whispered, "Like I want to watch a bunch of fat people exercising and getting yelled at for an hour. I'm living that." Barry said, "You wouldn't believe the size of the Seminole we saw coming up the beach road. He had a little blonde tucked under his arm like a ventriloquist dummy." He turned his head around to see Delron and said, "He was big as a house or what?" Delron nodded solemnly, and Barry said, "Not as big in here." Then he flexed his scrawny arms and said, "But tall as a telephone pole." Tammy said, "That's Standing Bear." And Barry said, "Standing Bear? I was thinking him and Delron ought to wrestle on the TV. And damn if he doesn't already have a wrestler's name. There's money there somewhere." Tammy said, "That's Standing Bear and Oksana. They're getting married." And Barry frowned and said, "Married? No, he should wrestle." Tammy said, "I bet they're coming up here. We invited them, and they might invite us to the wedding. I bet they will." The whole time Barry had been talking, I was watching Delron and Pearl. He'd look at her, and when she caught him, he'd look away. Then she'd look at him, and when he caught her, she'd look away. It was like they were pretending they didn't know each other, but you could tell they did. Tammy turned to Pearl and said, I might be the flower girl, and I'll wear a shiny pink dress and matching shoes, and I'll toss rose petals down the aisle for her to walk on. And they're going to have a 3-layer cake with the bride and groom on top, and they might let me keep it. And they're going to save the top layer in the freezer for a year because it's good luck. And there's going to be a chocolate fountain with fresh strawberries and cubes of buttery pound cake. Pearl smiled down at her and said, that'll be nice, but not like she didn't know the truth of it. Then Clyde stood up to go and said, sounds like a fancy affair. He crossed the street and everyone called after him, and he waved over one shoulder without looking back before he disappeared into the garage. Del Ryan tried to swallow a burp and said, I like Clyde. And Tammy said, me too. He gave us a bag of oranges last night. Then she snapped her fingers and said, I should go get some. That's just what I'll do. They're really good. She skipped up the sidewalk into the house, and then we all turned to watch the Brevard County Sheriff's Cruiser creeping down our street with the side searchlight, checking out between the condos. Barry said, here comes Dwayne's taxi. It pulled up ahead of Barry's Corolla and angled in against the curb. The passenger window hung down, and it was Officer Orange, his short hair matted into spikes from the ocean. The deputy driving was in uniform, and he looked like he was Italian or maybe Spanish, with thick black hair greased back like it was still the 1980s. He was wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. Officer Orange looked at me and said, hey, buddy, you seen Tampon John? That fucking... He looked at Delron and thought twice about whatever he was going to say. That fucker tore up my Jeep, ripped all my valve stems off, even the spare. The other cop leaned forward and smiled. Hey, Delron. Delron bobbed his head, and Tammy came out with a blue plastic bowl full of oranges. And for some reason, 2 thoughts came into my head at exactly the same moment. The first one was that cops don't like to get out of their cars if they don't have to. Not down here in the heat or up north in the cold. I had one tell me, I don't get out of the car unless I get to shoot something. But that was back when I was a loudmouth drunk, so maybe he was just trying to make a point. The other thought was that oranges aren't that much of a novelty down here in Florida, not after you've lived here a while. But they're still special to Tammy. Special enough that she'll eat so many she gets sores on her tongue if she's not careful. Well, oranges aren't much of a novelty unless they're wearing a cop uniform. Tammy stopped behind me and didn't move like she was playing freeze tag. Officer Orange said, I'm sitting on 4 flats and our tow driver's out on a run. When I catch him, I'm going to tase him right in the nutsack. We'll see how those tampons dance around then. Tammy put her head against the small of my back, and I heard the hitch in her breath she makes when she's crying. I looked at him and said, sounds to me like you got off lucky. He looked at me with one eye closed and said, how do you figure? I said, valve stems are what, couple bucks a piece? Hell, you probably get them free down at the city garage. And they'll even mount them up for you. Then I spit on the ground between me and the cruiser and said, if you'd lit me up with fireworks and pissed all over my stuff, I'd have sliced open your sidewalls. I pointed at him and said, then you'd be looking at some real money. The other cop turned to him and said, you pissed on his stuff? Then he cuffed Officer Orange in the ear so hard his head bounced off the window frame and said, what in the fuck is wrong with you? Seriously, man, that Roy juice is making you fucking retarded. Barry looked at Officer Orange and said, you urinated on a homeless guy's stuff? Couldn't you find any puppies to stomp on? The other cop barked a laugh, and Officer Orange checked the corner of his bleeding mouth and mumbled something I couldn't make out. If we catch him, I'm going to let him tase your nuts if we can find any. Then he leaned across the front seat and said, sorry to bother you folks. You have a good evening now. The window went up and the cruiser ran up over the edge of the curb before it drove off. Pearl said, I hope that one pulls over my husband some night, but I didn't know which one she meant. Delron sniffled and wiped his nose on the back of his hand, and he said, them two don't know how to play good cop, bad cop. Nothing breaks up a party faster than cops, and it was just seconds before Pearl went into the house and Barry and Delron hit the road. Tammy still had her face pressed against the small of my back, and when she spoke, I could feel the warmth of her breath through the thin fabric of my worn t-shirt. She said, nobody stayed for marshmallows. And that's that. I am not getting audio. Is that just me?
Everybody is muted right now. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can, I just, yes, it just came on. Thank you. Bob, can you hear me?
Everybody's muted at the moment.
Okay, I
Keifel's
was
got
gonna
us
ask,
all muted. Keifel's got us all muted.
okay. All right. Did you have a questions you want to ask, or I'm not quite sure where to go from here, except to talk.
Well, sometimes, Tom, I picture that in your day job, you're really sitting at the counter at the Big Lots, finding these characters or something. So where does all this come from? These are wonderful people that you describe.
Well, I think when we were talking about this program, and we were talking about empathy, and I think that you have to get in touch with your inner empath, I think, to even be a writer or a human. But that I was much more articulate when I was going through this earlier today. That you have to find these characters, and then you have to be willing to do the deep dive into what makes them fully human and fully realized. And hold on a second. I had a short story called Dancing Turtle, which is done just remarkably well. It won the first contest that they had out of the Santa Barbara Writers Conference. It's been anthologized in 2 different anthologies in England. I turned it into a one-act play that won the Samuel French Off-Broadway Festival up in New York a few years back. And that story, it's very short, it's about 5 pages, and it is from the point of view of an almost uncommunicative 14-year-old girl with cerebral palsy. And that all came out of, they probably don't have down in Tennessee, but up in here in Ohio, they have the Appalachian Festival. and they inhabit Coney Island, which is the old amusement park that's down on the river. And we went there one time when my sons were small, and you get the kettle corn, and you walk around, and they had some Native Americans that were doing a drum circle. And when they started the drumming, then the people sort of going around the drummers on the outside in a circular. And this girl got up to do that, right? To go around that circle while they were drumming. And she was probably needed a walker to get through her daily life. She had an incredibly hard time walking, but she was not going to be denied participating in that. And then there was also one of the Indian singers was a young guy, and he was in a sort of brand new bright red cowboy shirt. And just that was enough to basically do her internal life about that moment in her life. And the story, it covers basically the ride to the Appalachian Festival with her mom and that incident. And, I think that the only thing, the only reason that was a successful story and a successful play was that it touched something that would not have gotten done if you don't take the deep dive to look beyond what you're seeing, to imagine the person and how they got to that moment, right? And in Tiki Man, there's a character named Tampon John, who is one of the homeless guys. And he starts off as almost a joke, right? Because the name Tampon John is funny, because you're trying to figure out exactly why a guy would be named that, right? And that's the beginning of that. And today, when I was getting ready for this, just as a sort of interesting exercise, I tracked Tampon John through the entire novel and how he went from being this sort of joke in one of the early chapters to being quite fully realized by the middle of the book, and then actually being a participant in the very end of the book, the chapter of it. And his humanity, even from the I point of view, from the pair character, is that by that final chapter, he stops calling him Tampon John and calls him John. And that's all that is that, he gets to that point where, he has a history, and you find out that, he's a Vietnam vet that just never quite came back. And he lives in the bushes along the beach with a number of these other guys. And, Pear's relationship to these guys is entirely changed and entirely dependent upon Tammy. Because once he's taken care of Tammy, once she is his charge, his relationship changes to those guys, right? He has to be, more cautious. Very early in the book, a new guy shows up, and well, here, let me read that little bit, and it's just about a paragraph long, but I think it's important because pair. So Tammy, she looked at me like I couldn't have said anything dumber. You know, that's got nothing to do with it, Pear. Sometimes you need taking care of. Everybody does. I knew she was right. Everybody needs taking care of. Maybe not all the time, but most of it. Because it's a goddamn hard row to hoe the other way. I may not know much, but I know that. Clyde's got Vera and Vera's got Clyde. Dwayne's got Pearl, even though she's got a mouth that might make him wish he hadn't. Delron's got Barry, even though he might not appreciate it. Missy has Gracita, and Tammy's got me. And even Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail have Miriam the cat lady. I think that's what finally goes wrong with the homeless guys on the beach, like Tampon John and Crap Pants from this morning. They've got no one to take care of and no one to take care of them. So they just don't give a shit about any of it. How else could you end up squatting in the bushes, staring at some little girl's ass and playing with your dick? How else could you fall in a hole so deep? And that's, yeah.
Well, I just think, Tom, that it's the character, the main characters, they're Pear and Tammy. They're both, I mean, they're not superheroes. You know, I didn't, things you don't notice till I've been into the book, and that's what you've got on the front of it. From Catherine Ryan Hyde, Atkinson shows us there is hope in the smallest of hearts and love in the roughest of gestures. That, I mean, they're flawed people, but there's, I mean, it's not depressing what's going on in their lives.
They're not superheroes, and Pear makes a lot of mistakes. I mean, you know, his heart's in the right place, and he's making a decision based on his limited abilities, and sometimes the decisions he's making are not right. And that's actually one of my favorite chapters in the book, is when this, you know, an older woman tells him that, you know, he's not taking care of her. And in his mind, he is taking care of her, but just on the evidence at hand, maybe he's not doing such a great job. And I think that, I mean, the genesis for Pear and Tammy was maybe a 5-second interaction from my in-laws used to have a condo on a little street in Cape Canaveral, Florida. And it was a neighborhood, like everything in Florida, boom or bust, right? And there are times when it was up and there are times when it was down. And when it was down, you got some sort of, you know, sketchy people on the street. And we were walking to the beach one day, and there was a man, mid-30s, fur haircut, tan. He looked, I don't know, I don't work in class in a denigrating, he looked like he worked with his hands, and probably not in any kind of skilled job. And this little girl, maybe 10, and what I heard sort of looking at him, and we're watching by these little snippets of conversation, is that they were both incredibly, they didn't know who the other person was from Adam. And it was obvious that they got sort of thrown together, and he was supposed to be watching her for the day. And they were both trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this, right? And for the guy's part, he was like trying to figure out what in God's name might interest a 10-year-old girl that he had any skill set in, right? And he can't think of anything. And what they arrived at, which was the absolute greatest thing because of the specificity of it, was that there's a bridge where all the fishermen go to fish, right? Over one of the 10 million little canals that are in Florida. And there's a power line that runs just off of the bridge. And where all the fishermen cast their rods, the lures got wrapped around the power line and they had no choice just to, cut the string, and the lures are hanging up there, right? There's like 1,000 lures caught in this power line. And somehow this guy had some mechanism of getting them down. And that was what he had proposed, was that they were going to go to this bridge and get these fishing lures down. And I guess he had a market.
Zoom frozen. Come back to us, Tom.
I'm frozen.
Yeah, you're back
Am I
now.
frozen?
Yes.
You're back.
You're just frozen.
Okay. Could you hear what I was saying?
We
Was the audio working?
got to where the lures were coming down.
That was my tech, my lovely wife and tech. So yeah, so their decision was to go harvest these fishing lures off of the power line. And that, I suppose, had some interest even to a 10-year-old girl, right? Because it was going to be some magic happening there. But I thought that, that's where Pear and Tammy, that's how they meet, right? I mean, dad put her on a bus in Ohio. She gets off the bus in Florida expecting to meet her mother. Her mother's now in jail. So her mother's boyfriend and the guy across the street with a car have come up to get her. And at the day that the book takes place is maybe 3 months after that. And I think that, Bob, you were talking about, I asked you if there's anything you wanted me to do today, and you wanted to make sure you introduce Tammy. And I think that what I love about Tammy and what I loved writing about Tammy was that Pear's not always the adult in this relationship. As a matter of fact, there's loads of times when he's not the adult. And there's kind of, I want to think like a mutual surrogacy, right? It's like they're both taking care of each other depending on their needs and abilities, and I mean, and she's telling him not to scoot his feet along the boardwalk so he doesn't get a splinter, right? So in a sense, there are times, when she's the mother, watching out for him. And there are times too when they're both kind of at a loss of, and when they're both at a loss, they have to sort of come to an agreement about how they should proceed, because neither one of them have any idea how to proceed on that.
Tom, there was one question that came through on the chat from Jeanette. She's the one I introduced to you about the drama work, the playwriting workshop. And
Yes.
She's asking about the story you told about changing the short story to a play. How did that work? You have to leave out all the interior thoughts, feelings, what is left besides dialogue. How was that? That's a
No, you don't. Actually, that was the first thing, right? I sat down because the story, it's all told from the point of view of the girl. So it's, this entire internal thing. So for staging it, because my career path was a little odd. I was doing a lot of, I had done my work in fiction, and then I decided to write a play. And the first play that I wrote got picked up for like this regional Wart production, like 17,000 people came to see it. It was insane. And it was total dumb luck, but that got me involved in theater for a while. And then I decided to go back to short stories. So I had plenty of experience in theater, but what I did was that I had the girl with cerebral palsy be virtually nonverbal for the play, but behind her was her idealized version of herself, who was prettier, articulate, and that is how all that internal monologue was given to the audience, right? And all the conversation, right? Like, like her communicating with her mother, her communicating with her father, her trying to communicate with the Native American boy at the dance. Those things were all the actual girl who was inarticulate, who had a hard time walking. But everything that was going on behind that was her idealized self in those scenes. So, I mean, I think, theater, it's challenging that way, and that, you have to find a way around. You have to find a way to solve that problem. And I don't think anything's not solvable in theater. I mean, that first play that I was talking about, I knew nothing about writing a play, so it had like 20, I think it had 26 characters. And even when we did like double and triple characters, we had like blown the budget for, half of the year, but it worked, right? And much of that was making things into other things, right? There were just areas of the stage that became other things for the stories being told from that character. Does that help?
That's helpful. That sounds good. I think Jeanette said amazing. We've got about 15 minutes before the hour. Do you think we could ask some other folks if they have questions?
Absolutely, because I've done enough talky talk, so I'd love to answer some questions. Right. Anything specific, theoretical?
I'll just make one comment before we go on, because I see behind you the poster for Johnny Cash, and I read about what Tammy just loves Johnny Cash. But anyone else want to jump in and ask Tom a question?
Oh, well, here. There's my comically large cover for Tiki Man. It's like Publishers Clearinghouse came here and they showed up at my door. So, yeah, here's your book cover. Who's got a question?
So yeah, I do. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So Tom, I'm curious how long you spent on Tiki Man, and do you have a lot of words beyond that were in Tiki Man that you took out? Was there a lot of outtakes that you may turn to short stories or characters that you, and I guess sort of a separate question is, do you take any outtake characters and create short stories from them, or are they pretty much organic?
It's usually gone the opposite way. I mean, in the sense that I've done a short story with a character in it. There was a short story called Blue Highway, and the I character in that is a Neil Diamond impersonator on a gambling boat. And that short story, I wasn't done with that Neil Diamond impersonator, so I brought him back for Tiki Man. And I don't tend to have a lot of outtake. I don't tend to do much rewriting. And everybody, one of the reasons I'm always reluctant in like this kind of thing is that, I don't have any advice to offer anybody, right? I mean, however it works for you, make that work. Like the whole thing where somebody's going to sit there and say, yeah, make sure you write every day. I would just write crap 99 out of 100 days. So I don't see any point in that. Other people do that. That's great. If it works for them, do it. I tend to let things like, eat away at my brain like a parasite until I just have to get it out on the page. And then when I do that, it's usually pretty fully formed. I mean, the only thing in Tiki Man, I had this just unbelievably good agency who wanted to represent the book, and they wanted a few changes, and the changes that they wanted had to do with Pear's backstory. And actually, that ended up being a good exercise, and I ended up liking that stuff that they'd asked me to put in. They weren't any more specific than that. They just said, we want more backstory on Pear. Now, of course, after doing that, a flu went through the agency and they forgot that they were going to represent. And that's honest to God truth. It was like the weirdest thing ever. But so that was pretty much all the like rewriting stuff that went on with Tiki Man. Does that help?
Tom, there's a question
Yeah.
from Antonio. How would you create a character worksheet? What would you put on the checklist for a character draft? But I'm not sure you have such a thing from what you just said.
Yeah, I don't. And again, that's what I'm saying about, like sort of not letting other people tell you things that you should or shouldn't have. I mean, if a character worksheet works for you, and if that's helpful, I think that you should do it. But I mean, for my own, I'm sure that I have a mental worksheet for the character, and I think that is probably just to go beyond the obvious, especially with your secondary characters, and go beyond what is that obvious first thing that hits you, and get into their head far enough that you know what's making them tick and what's making them, for any reason, why they're your secondary character. Whether you use that or not, whether you throw it away after you've written it down, that's great too. But I think that that's valuable information for you to have on all of your characters, that you should think about their backstory and know enough about them that you can throw all of their backstory away. Because if you know them in that way, then their responses are not going to be anything other than their responses, right? Because there's only certain things that come out of that guy's mouth or that woman's mouth, right? And if what comes out of her mouth could come out of anybody's mouth, then you should probably throw it away and look at it and how to make it specific to that person.
All right. Anybody?
Am I supposed to be checking this chat down here?
I've been checking it for you.
Okay, good idea. Let's keep it that way.
So how about others?
Come on.
So I'll say something. This is Meg, if I may.
Go, Meg.
I'm new to all of this, and the idea that what I'm understanding is sort of like you let something form in your mind and then you sit down and it's there. And that's incredible. That has never been the case for me. So if that's the case for you, then what is your revision process like?
I don't have much of a revision process. And I know that that's dumb luck, but it really isn't dumb luck, right? Because I mean, a lot of my writing friends Catherine Ryan Hyde, who's a mentor. I mean, she writes 2 books a year. A friend of mine, Chris Nixon, who is he writes historical mysteries, set leads. He writes at least 2-3 books a year. And with the way that I do it, I'm not that prolific, and I can't make it happen, and I can't make it rush. But when it happens pretty fully formed. I don't go back. I'm trying to think of an instant in which I've done big revisions, and I actually can't think of anything that I've done big revisions on. I mean, I just finished a short story called Kentucky Unicorn, and that was weird, and that usually things sort of come to me A to Z. And this one was kind of A, B, C, and then I hit a wall. So I said, oh, let's start at the end and work backwards. And then I kind of went back to the beginning again. And it ended up that eventually they sort of met in the middle. And then when they did, I could go, sort of follow it through to the end again, and make sure that I had all those voices honest, to themselves for the whole story. And that worked out. It wasn't a way that I'd ever done it before, but it worked. So, for that story, that was the process. But I guess if you look at your work and you think it needs revision, then, trust yourself to do that. But I also think that you want to trust yourself and say that I don't have to redo this just because it came easy, right? That sometimes you get those little gifts and you have to know what they are and then leave them alone, and maybe everything before them and after them you need to work, but don't, if you can, and hey, I'm not going to be one of those, I'm going to tell you, like, if I go back and read stuff, there'll be times when I'll be like, wow, did I write that? That's really good. Okay, and that sounds like really conceited or something, but it's not. I mean, if you're going to be a writer, you better write stuff that's good, and you better be able to recognize that, even if you haven't seen it in a while, and you go back to it. You have to look at it and say, yeah, okay, then that's why I'm able to, tell people that I'm a writer.
Okay,
I haven't gotten
couple
the
more
hang of
questions.
looking at the camera.
What else,
Come
folks?
on. Linda, Bonnie, we haven't heard from you guys. Marilyn, you, Kathy.
Yeah, this is Tracy. I'll say something. If anyone finds that yeah, Tom's writing is amazing, but if anyone finds that statement that he never revises super annoying like I do, then because I'm writing a novel and I'm constantly revising it. And of course, he's wonderful to have around to help. But yeah, I could never write like that, but I don't know how he does that. But yeah, that's really interesting trait.
And annoying.
It is annoying.
Well, I think we can, I mean, for many of us, it is different, but it works for Tom. And to me, it sort of works for the kind of writing you are doing, Tom, and I've known this kind of writing from you for a long time. And, it's just this association with these characters that are really engaging characters. And I think it works well. That's all I can say. That it's not what I do and try to do, but it works well.
Well, I think there's the immediacy of, right, I write pretty much exclusively first person because that, if writing is what it's making, I'm trying to think how to say this. You know, you're the only person that you know, right? You don't know what it's like to be any other human being on the planet. Yeah, you can guess. And yes, those people make themselves known to you by what they say and what they do. But I think, you know, that I character, for me, that's the only time I get to do that, right? I get to get into somebody's head, and that's what it's like to be that person. So I want it to be as honest and accurate and immediate as that can be. And that's why even, I mean, in this book, in Tiki Man, I'm really fascinated with at what point a story goes from being the simple past, historic past, telling of a story, to when it becomes the now of telling the story. And that happens in Tiki Man. And I think the greatest thing about it is that no one has noticed it yet. And I think that that's a good thing.
Tom,
Okay.
here's something else
Um,
from the chat box. Linda Parsons, who is known for her poetry around here wonderfully, but she writes wonderful essays. She's been into theater. And so she says, I'm curious about your moving from fiction to theater and back again. Which do you prefer? And do you love things about both, and will keep doing both? And she says, love your character and their depth.
Thank you. Actually, the reason I got out of that, I sort of went back to fiction, is when the market crashed in 2008. I lost 2 productions, and one of them was at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, which is like sort of like the biggest deal theater on the West Coast. And when the bottom fell out and all these theaters lost like 40% of their operating budgets, the first thing that went were new works. And so I just got a phone call one day that said, we canceled that entire second stage season, and we canceled it for next year too. And the same thing happened. I had the same play was going to be done in Cincinnati. And so I had a lot of time on my hands. So I really started going back into short stories then. And I still love plays, but I had a really unfortunate experience with a theater in Chicago a few years back, and that kind of made me swear it off for a little while. And I'm hoping that I'm going to come back to it, but just very briefly, this a theater with, you know, they had this short. It's full-length play, and I'd sent them this full-length play as it's a one-woman show. And it had a number of productions, but they wanted to put it in their festival, and whoever won the festival was going to get an equity production, which is a huge thing, right? I mean, so all these people were there, right? And there was a problem. Oh, it's going to be you. It's not going to be you, right? Well, come to find out that these people had this contest for 7 years, and 6 out of the 7 years, either the artistic director or the artistic director's husband had won first place. 6 out of 7 years. And I'm like, okay, you know, I mean, I've had enough plays put on that I could call bullshit on it, but it didn't like break my heart, right? But there were like 6 other people there that had traveled from various parts of the country to see their play staged for the first time, right? It was like the first time ever that they were seeing their work up on stage. And they were laboring under the illusion that this was some even playing field, and that, you know, that they had as good a shot as anyone, and it was, you know, going to be the work that spoke for itself. when it was like, no, it's just bullshit. It's, you're just window dressing to make it seem legitimate for them. So that, like I said, that kind of put a bad taste in my mouth for theater, and I'm going to go back to it at some point. But I don't think there's that much difference, and everybody thinks that there's a huge difference between writing plays. I mean, there's a friend of mine out in Minneapolis, and he said that he hated writing fiction. He preferred theater because it just took so damn long to get somebody across the room in fiction, right? Instead of just telling that character they had to be over here, you actually had to get them there. And there's a little bit of that, but I like I said, I like them both, and I don't, I don't hold one above the other. I'll say that.
Okay. Well, Tom, we're close to ending. I want to give Nancy, you have a report about the election for us. She's
Well,
still
here, while it's quiet, I'm going to plug Tiki Man, the lifeblood of publishing with a small publisher are the reviews. And if you read it and you like it, if you could leave it a good review on Amazon, Goodreads, whatever you join. It doesn't have to be long. You don't have to pretend you're an academic. It can be 10 words, but those reviews really help. And I'm glad that you guys all came to hear me blab tonight.
Well, it was wonderful. I think Nancy's not here anymore, so we'll get that on the website for the elections. Tom, it was wonderful to have you, and everybody else give Tom a great hand. So,
Bob, thank you. And
it's
thank you,
good
everyone.
to see you. It's good to see
Thank you,
you.
Tom.
Come
Thanks,
down to
Tom.
come down to Loudon County sometime.
I will, because I forgot to tell you my Tennessee dump story, so I'll have to do that another time.
It's okay. Tracy, thank you too for keeping him in line.
See
Bye
ya.
now.
Thank you.
Bye bye,
You're welcome.
everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. Enjoyed it.